Exposure to cold and body fat may not be what comes to mind when you first think of healthy activities and a healthy metabolism. We usually think of fat as just an inert substance, something used for excess calorie storage. And you probably think of cold as something to be avoided at all costs so you don't get sick. But today we're going to talk about how we can metabolically activate our body fat through cold exposure. So first, types of fat: white, brown, and beige. We all know what body fat is, but what you may not know is that there are three types of body fat, and we can actually change some of our body fat from an inactive to a more metabolically active form just through our diet and lifestyle behaviors. Now, in a paper here noted, white, brown, beige, different adipose cells for different functions. You can look this up. I'm going to have all of my sources here and in the links below, but this is just talking about the three different types of fat. Now, we know white fat is responsible for energy storage. Brown fat is a metabolically active kind of fat, which is responsible for something called non-shivering thermogenesis. And the third type of fat is called beige or sometimes bright fat, which is just a conjunction of brown and white. And it can actually be both brown or white depending on what function is needed at that time. And it's able to shift from one type to the other. So, can something as simple as cold temperatures really change our fat? In a study titled Cold-Induced Activation of Brown Adipose Tissue and Adipose Angiogenesis in Mice, scientists were able to see that exposure of both humans and rodents to cold does activate thermogenic activity in brown adipose tissue. Thermogenesis just means production of heat. So what kind of cold exposure are we talking about here? Now, here's the part where you might expect me to tell you that you've got to join in one of those polar bear plunges, or you have to take cold showers, or maybe you have to go roll around in the snow. But you don't actually have to do anything that extreme. You can do those things, but in a paper that was titled uh, Induction of Thermogenesis in Brown and Beige Adipose Tissues, Molecular Markers, Mild Cold Exposure, and Novel Therapies, we see that acute and repeated mild cold exposure in adult humans was able to increase activity in brown fat. But the scientists also noted that this increased volume of brown fat, so it means that it literally shifted some of the fat that was previously white, some of that beige fat, from white to brown, which made it more metabolically active. So, what do we mean by mild cold exposure? Well, they observed these results based on exposure to temperatures of 17 to 19 degrees Celsius, which is just 62 to 66 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's not all that cold at all. Now, it may be that there's a correlation between either the level of cold, the temperatures that are even colder may induce more browning of fat, but that's not listed in this paper here. And to say the colder the exposure, the less time you should want to expose yourself to it, which goes back to that acute exposure that they were talking about. So, how does cold exposure actually increase activity and volume of brown fat? Well, the paper entitled Cold-Inducible KLF9 regulates thermogenesis of brown and beige fat. Now, cold exposure increases KLF9, and KLF9 stands for Kruppel-like factor 9. Now, KLF9 is an important nuclear transcription factor. You see, when genes express themselves, it involves a cellular process that's called transcription and translation, which occurs in the nucleus. Now, we don't have to get into all the details here, but long story short, Kruppel-like factor 9 is a protein that either activates or inhibits expression of certain genes, meaning it turns them on or it turns them off. Now, the amount of KLF9 found in these adipose cells was increased by cold exposure. Interestingly, KLF9 levels in human white adipose tissue are inversely correlated with the amount of body fat presence. And this makes sense because the more body fat someone has, the less thermogenesis they're going to need because they already have a lot of body fat to insulate them from the cold. But that doesn't mean we can't shift these numbers in our favor through a little ancestral lifestyle biohacking. So some other interesting finds from this particular study, scientists used fat-specific KLF9 transgenic mice. And they noted that these mice gained less weight and had smaller fat deposits due to the increased thermogenesis of their brown and beige fat. The scientists also noted that these mice displayed lower fasting blood glucose levels, improved glucose tolerance, and improved insulin sensitivity. Those are pretty enticing things that a lot of people would like. So, how can high fat and a high protein diet actually support this thermogenesis? Well, there's a study on that too. In a study titled BCAA Catabolism in Brown Fat Controls Energy Homeostasis, BCAAs were found to be required for brown fat activation. During cold exposure, brown adipose tissue actively utilizes these branched chain amino acids in the mitochondria for thermogenesis. Now, you may have heard of branched chain amino acid supplements before, but branched chain amino acids are actually found in abundance in animal-based foods such as meat, poultry, fish, eggs, and dairy. All branched chain amino acids are just the components that make up protein. So all the things that you might eat on an animal-based diet are going to support this branched chain amino acid brown fat activation. What about high-fat diets? How do those support brown fat? Well, high-fat diets, this is another study, and this study is called The Intake of High-Fat Diets Induces the Acquisition of Brown Adipocyte Gene Expression Features in White Adipose Tissues. I know that's a mouthful, but I'm putting all this in here so that if you want to look up these studies, you can. So these scientists studied a high-fat diet, and they found that high-fat diets were able to increase the expression of something called UCP1 in both white and brown fat, and that it increased browning capacity. So what is UCP1? Well, UCP1 just stands for uncoupling protein 1, which is also known as thermogenin. And this is a mitochondrial carrier protein. It's found in brown adipose tissue, and it is used to generate heat by non-shivering thermogenesis. So mitochondrial carriers are just proteins that transfer molecules across the membrane of mitochondria. And finally, in a final study called Brown Fat Biology and Thermogenesis, scientists found that UCP1 uncouples adenosine triphosphate production from the fat substrate oxidation in brown tissue. What does that mean? Okay, what that means is that the activity of this brown adipose tissue was not dependent on the amount of fat in the cell, but instead it was dependent on the availability of fatty acids that could be delivered to the cell and utilized as a fuel for thermogenesis. Now, this makes sense because you don't want the brown adipose tissue, which is being used for non-shivering thermogenesis. This brown fat is being used itself to generate the heat. If it was reliant on its own fat in the cell, eventually it would use up that fat and it would essentially just burn out then. So what you want is you want that production of ATP to be decoupled from the fat in the cell, and you want it to be dependent on fat that can be delivered to the cell. So it makes sense. At the end of the day, though, what does this all mean for us?
Well, let's connect the dots. We know that cold exposure upregulates brown fat volume and activity. We know that fatty acids are burned by this brown fat to produce thermogenesis. And we know that branched chain amino acids, like the highly bioavailable, balanced, and complete forms found in animal foods, are necessary for this process as well. This means an animal-based diet is, nutritionally speaking, highly capable of supporting the browning of fat and thermogenesis.
If we wanted to try to adopt a behavior that would help, what can we do? In short, it just means that mild cold exposure coupled with an animal-based diet, like say carnivore, can actually upregulate metabolically active fat, brown fat. And at least in mice, this was associated with additional benefits of lower fasting blood glucose levels, improved glucose tolerance, and improved insulin sensitivity. Well, as I said before, temperatures needed to begin triggering this weren't all that cold, just 62 to 66 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you wanted to do something, you could simply take a walk on a cooler day, and that exposure could shift some of this beige fat to a more metabolically active brown fat. In addition, you could do the other things that I mentioned. If it's no longer wintertime and you no longer have access to cold temperatures through weather, then you could do things like expose yourself to a cold shower or do like an ice bath plunge if there's a place near you that offers cold therapy or cryotherapy. You could do those. So any of these activities, again, in a acute manner, meaning brief exposure could lead to that upregulation of brown fat and that thus metabolic activity. That makes this fat work for you and burn any excess calories if it's needed to. So I hope you enjoyed today's topic. This is kind of a deep dive into a little bit of a biohack, but something to keep in mind for the future. And even though we're leaving winter now, it's something that you can keep in the back of your mind for next winter, or you can adapt it again using cold plunges or cold showers just to help upregulate the activity, the metabolic activity of your fat, and as a result, hopefully have an impact on blood glucose and glucose tolerance and your insulin sensitivity. So if you'd like to see more original content like this, it would really help out if you would then like and subscribe to the channel. It'll help the algorithm and it will help us get noticed so that we can produce more of this content for you.
So if you enjoyed today's information, I provide information just like this to my clients to help improve energy, burn fat, and build muscle through an ancestral lifestyle and diet. My program doesn't involve gimmicks like bars and shakes, counting points, tracking macros, or even spending hours and hours doing cardio in the gym. Now, I've not only used this program to help clients improve well being and health, but I also used it as a part of my own personal transformation. So, if you're looking for an easy, intuitive way of eating and simple lifestyle adjustments to improve your well being, then click on the link in the description below to book your free, no obligation discovery call today.